Good day, assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point here on Hilaal TV. My name is Fahraaz Patel. Would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. A big week for South Africa, of course, started on Saturday when the Springboks won their fourth Rugby World Cup title. We saw earlier on today Minister Enoch Godongwana delivering the midterm budget speech. But starting tomorrow is another important week, well, important day of the week, important days of the week for South Africa. It's the AGOA forum that South Africa is hosting here in Johannesburg. Of course, this sees many African countries getting together along with the United States to renew trade agreements. Now, of course, this does come on the back of many geopolitical issues that are happening across the world. And of course, the BRICS summit that South Africa had hosted 2 months ago. Joining me to discuss this, I'd like to welcome political analyst Sandile Swana and the Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Patrick Bond. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here. Professor, I want to start off with you. So obviously last week, we saw Minister of Trade and Industry Ibrahim Patel being very enthusiastic about the potential to renew AGOA. Is there, from what you're seeing, a very same scenario or same enthusiasm from the United States?
Assalamu alaikum. It's great to be with you. I've been in and out of the United States since the late 60s. So I've been, I did my PhD there. I know the place. And there are 2 United States. So what Ibrahim Patel is counting on is Joseph Biden's continuation, that he is reelected about a year from now, early November of 2024. If he's not, and if Donald Trump wins, then all bets are off. And in fact, the current polls put Donald Trump as high as 8 points ahead. And even if it's about even, there are so many tricks that the Republican Party plays. Why is this important? Donald Trump's already signaled through the protectionism, the xenophobia, the racism, the extreme Zionism, that he doesn't like South Africa. And he's already put on tariffs on our aluminium and steel. And his Republican Party hate that South Africa appears to be not too neutral in the big question of Ukraine. So I think this is one of those moments where if we're gambling on being in AGOA in 2025, it's a flip of the coin. It could go either way. So I would say it's a real mistake to do what is being done now, including by Ibrahim Patel, which is to hype this deal and also to look at it without a class analysis. I think if we do a class analysis and a geopolitical analysis where we see the United States supporting Israel at this time truly of genocide of the people of Gaza, then we should be questioning, not celebrating AGOA.
Mr. Swana, I want to bring you into the conversation. Ibrahim Patel's just doing the bidding for government, isn't he? I mean, he's got to, of course, as being part of cabinet, do whatever he can to make sure that South Africa stays in AGOA. It's just part and parcel of what he has to do.
I think that the game that Patel has got to play is the political game of saying, even if there's a fallout between the USA and South Africa, of which all the ingredients are starting to fall in place, it will be as if South Africa tried its very best not to kill the relationship. But at the same time, as South Africans, politically that is, we cannot be part of anything that represents settler colonialism that is based on forced removals and genocide, as well as apartheid that was confirmed by Jimmy Carter, former president of the United States. So South Africa politically, as a member of the Global South and the ANC specifically as a liberation movement, cannot be seen to be outrightly hostile to the United States. It's better if the United States chases us out than if we walk out, I suppose, for the time being. So that is basically a balancing game, but it will not be devastating if we lose AGOA anyway.
Professor Bond, Mr. Swana brings up quite a potential that could happen, that if the United States says, bye-bye South Africa, we don't need you for AGOA, but then you have opposition political parties, namely the Democratic Alliance, who wants to make sure I mean, if they have to come into power in next year's elections, they will do everything to make sure that they maintain AGOA. So the opposition within South Africa, they're keeping a keen eye on this, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, the DA and its new partners, they have a tricky situation because, A, they're terrible on the question of the Israeli settler occupation of Palestine. They're basically mute on that question. And they're also terrible when it comes to using our scarce resources in South Africa in support of multinational corporations. And this goes back to the fact that, way back when it was the Democratic Party, it was a guy called Zach de Beer who put into place the neoliberal politics associated with the DA today. Now, that means that no matter what we do in terms of the scarcity of our electricity or the climate change implications or the extraction of resources that our future generations will need, the DA is all for it. And that means that they support AGOA when it's multinational corporations from Australia, BHP Billiton, from Luxembourg, ArcelorMittal, from New York, and a little bit from Santon, Sasol, or the auto companies, mostly from Germany, Mercedes, BMW, VW, or Toyota, or Ford. Now, those are the main beneficiaries, along with some white-owned vineyards and horticulture and big agriculture. And I would ask this question to the DA. Have you calculated whether the electricity, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the depletion of non-renewable resources that go into these huge multinationals that are the main beneficiaries of AGOA, have you calculated, is it worth it if you instead could give it to the electricity, to a rural woman, to a small business, to labor-intensive industry? We could have a boom in this country because these guys, the big ones, the energy-intensive users group, they use 42% of our electricity and produce less than 20% of the output and less than 5% of the jobs. Those are the arguments, the class analysis, the ecological analysis, the gender analysis that I would say the DA and anybody who's supporting AGOA should be looking at. And if they do it honestly, then they'll say this is a bum deal. It's a great deal for big car companies in Frankfurt and Stuttgart, and for an Australian steel company that's already getting electricity at 30 cents a kilowatt hour, 1/8 of what I'm paying for it, and you too. And for really appalling companies that continue to rip us off. I think the AGOA relationship is one of multinational corporate elites, and it's heartbreaking that some of the trade unions, not all of them, GUUSA, the General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa, is an exception, but most of the COSATU trade unions are for AGOA without thinking, without doing the class analysis, and certainly without, as Sandile says, analyzing why the US is the main supporter and facilitator of the genocide of Palestinians. It's just unacceptable.
Mr. Swana, I want to bring in what Professor Pod had mentioned, trade unions. We saw last week COSATU, of course, led by its president, Zingiswa Losi, being part of the roundtable discussion ahead of this week's summit. When I see trade unions being involved, is there a question mark as to why they are there? Or are they just doing it because, heck, look, we're part of the tripartite alliance of the ruling party. We just need to be there to maybe offer them some sort of support?
I think what you've got to accept here is that for some years now, literally years, the COSATU unions, more especially, have collapsed their economic desk. So economic analysis is no longer happening in COSATU. And as a result of that, COSATU is unable, has not been able to make any strategic inputs at in any social compact, whether it's between labor, government, and big business, which is what tends to happen at NETLEC. NETLEC has been dead in the water. Right now, as we speak, COSATU unions are promoting privatization in the hope that somehow they will keep the jobs that they have now in the transport sector, for instance. So the problem you have with COSATU is the intellectual collapse of COSATU, so that they cannot identify the issues that need attention clearly and then direct their energy there. A lot of corruption has happened through the ANC with COSATU members in cabinet. Cyril Ramaphosa himself is a former COSATU member. Gwede Mantashe, another one, Kgalema Motlanthe, and the country, economically speaking, in terms of unemployment and poverty and inequality, has been run down because COSATU doesn't have the sharp analytical tools economically, the sharp moral tools. They don't even have the moral tools to address the situation. So whatever COSATU is trying to do with AGOA right now, it's shallow and it is not going to help anybody.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Patrick Bond and Sandile Swana. We're going to be talking geopolitical, two big events that have shaped the world in the last 2 years, of course, the Russia conflict with Ukraine, and of course, what is happening now with the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. How does that change things? Because South Africa have made, well, the ruling party has made their stance clear, but what will happen with regards to whether they can see eye to eye with the United States of America? Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're looking ahead to the AGOA summit that is starting this week here in Johannesburg. Professor Bond, South Africa have made it clear that they are neutral in the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, I'm going to start with that because that is, of course, the first world conflict that has really spun so many things into motion. That neutrality must be irritating America, isn't it? Because they want a clear answer from South Africa. You're either with Ukraine or you're with Vladimir Putin. And that irritates them, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't. It's particularly because South Africa hosted the BRICS. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa came. And not only that, South Africa has been, really to the great irritation of Washington, able to work with Xi Jinping from China and Vladimir Putin from Russia, and especially Lula da Silva from Brazil and Narendra Modi to pick off several crucial Middle Eastern allies of the US. And this is the site of the worst tug of war, where we've seen the Abraham Accords being extended. UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, the main city, and Abu Dhabi, the headquarters of that oil oligarchy, actually making friends with Israel in September 2020. We even had a South African arms manufacturer, Ivor Jacobitz and his Paramount, that set up a UAE headquarters and then moved and put a Tel Aviv office together, from which, well, we're worried, all manner of, let's say, Zionist activities like, promotion of various kinds of arms deals are underway. But secondly, it looks like Saudi Arabia will join, and that may be one of the reasons Hamas made this incursion into Israel on October 7. And third, there's Egypt. And of course, we know Egypt has always been, well, since Anwar Sadat's assassination, under the thumb of Washington, and they get huge amounts of money, and therefore they're not opening up the Rafah border crossing properly and really providing the Palestinians with the support required. And then we add Ethiopia, which, even though it's not in the Middle East, it's not an oil regime, has joined the BRICS, but of course, they're also the main donor recipient in Africa from the United States after Egypt. And they just voted, let's say, on a Friday, where there was a United Nations attempt to have a ceasefire in the General Assembly. They abstained, as did India. So you put India and Ethiopia, and you put Egypt and Saudi Arabia and UAE together. The geopolitics of the BRICS now look very much like that tug of war that I mentioned is being manipulated to Washington's advantage. So this is the big change, really, even in recent weeks, that after it looked like Saudi Arabia would pull away, that is, there would be a petro-yuan announced earlier this year that Saudi Arabia and Iran would make up. Now, these were the kinds of things that we could attribute to the power of China. And this is one of the sites where, let's say, a proxy Cold War is underway between the US and China. And it's over the push and pull in the BRICS. And it's basically, you can really feel it and see it when it comes to whether our Arab countries, part of the BRICS Plus, will support the Palestinians. And so far, they're not.
Mr. Swana, we're going to touch on, obviously, what's happening right now in the Middle East in a bit. But Mr. Swana, I want to bring you into, of course, the BRICS Summit. South Africa hosted the BRICS Summit. Strengthening of ties was, of course, the message that was kept on being said by President Cyril Ramaphosa. And he, of course, has that with regards to President Xi Jinping of China, Russian President Vladimir Putin. And then you add, of course, Saudi Arabia to the mix, one of those countries where the United States are trying to push the normalization of ties with Israel. The US are looking at this, and they're looking at this with a keen eye. Are they also at the same time worried that South Africa is drifting a bit too much towards BRICS and may not want to put all of their attention towards AGOA, and hence the USA may be thinking, this is just not looking good for us at the moment?
Yeah, I think that it is just polite talk for us to think that the South Africa under the leadership of the ANC, especially in foreign affairs, and even our Minister of Foreign Affairs for that matter, international relations, that we can be a darling of the United States. That would just be polite talk. I don't think there's enough things that we've done that would make us a darling of the United States. I suspect that the security establishment of the United States would look at us as recruiters for BRICS, as recruiters of people who will collapse the oil dollar, and all sorts of things like that. And our history in terms of the liberation movement doesn't matter whether it's not just the ANC. And with the Cold War, I mean, we don't want to call it a Cold War and proxy wars that are developing. I think that China has made an impression in trade, in technology, to the African countries, to BRICS itself, and to the United States. And South Africa is suspected strongly of being a buddy of China. And China is, at a minimum, a trade enemy of the United States. So there's complexity. And when you try to raise the issues of Western Asia and what some call the Middle East and all that mess over there, South Africa is not going to be able, under the leadership of the ANC, to maintain any neutrality or anything like that that's going to favor US policy.
Professor Bond, right now in the Middle East, of course, women and children, there's sometimes no words to explain it, but they're really going through the most difficult time within the Gaza Strip. You've got Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying, there's no truce. Are we going to continue the ground offensive? And if we have to, even continue the aerial bombardment. South Africa, from a historical point, and I'm talking the ANC as the ruling party, says they will always stand with the people of Palestine. You've got the United States saying, unequivocally, they're going to stand with Israel no matter what. They've even given them an $8 billion in terms of arming themselves even more. Tricky situation, isn't it, heading into this week?
Well, I hope it's a situation that allows us moral clarity. So, for example, BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, South Africa, which you can find on the website and look at all the different campaigns they have, mostly against US-based corporations, the likes of Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Pepsi. And you'll find very good BDS targets if you're wanting to stand in solidarity with Palestine. But I would even go further. So there'll be a protest between 2 and 4 p.m. on Saturday at Nasrec, the Soweto area where the big convention is and the big meeting of the summit of AGOA is taking place. I'll be there. I hope to see many of you and your listeners. Now, the main point, though, is I want to dispute a little bit with my friend Sandile, because I think there's a lot of talk left by the ANC, but there's a walk right. There's talk solidarity with Palestine, but the BDS movement says, well, why aren't you doing the BDS? Why aren't we putting some sanctions on Israeli products? Why do we still have Zim lines, the Israeli shipping company coming to the major ports of South Africa? Why are we letting El Al fly into OR Tambo? Why is the ambassador still here? I would even go so far, Sandile, to ask you, if President Ramaphosa went on a peace mission that was arranged by the same Ivor Ichikowitz, the arms dealer I mentioned, very strong Zionist, right? And if Kgalema Motlanthe and if Robert Gumede and if Matthews Posa have all been very tight with this man, Ivor Ichikowitz, and if he's part and parcel of militarizing one of the most important places in the world, the third largest gas field, makes the Middle East look minor in comparison. It's Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. There's an Islamic insurgency, a community-based struggle against these big oil companies and many other resource looters. It's the source of terrible violence. 6,000 have died, 1 million have been displaced. But who's that on behalf of, Sandile? Because if you think that the Pretoria government has somehow taken a position against the US and against Western Europe, then I ask you, why do we put 1,200 SANDF troops? Our army is in northern Mozambique. Who are they fighting on behalf of? Well, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, visited Ramaphosa along with Paul Kagame in 2021. He said, I'm worried about our Total Energies $10 billion facility in Cabo Delgado in the Afongi Peninsula. I want your black troops to go and protect my white company, my white shareholders, my French company. But it's not just Total, the second biggest company ready to move in alliance with the China National Petroleum Corporation is ExxonMobil. It's for that reason, Sandile, I'll fight you to say it's not an anti-imperialist African National Congress. It's a sub-imperialist when you look at what they're really doing.
Sandile, Mr. Swana, I'm going to give you to answer that.
I, by the way, don't differ much with you. There's a level that I will agree with you on, which is the detail. When I talked about sharpness, I was referring to COSATU, the sharpness of economic analysis that has dwindled, I think, for the past 20 years or so into nothing now. I have publicly stated that the ANC has lost intellectual capacity. The issues that you are talking about do need, first and foremost, clear intellectual capacity. Secondly, that intellectual capacity, once it is properly exercised, it brings moral clarity. The ANC has no moral clarity. For anyone to do the things you've just mentioned, chasing the ambassador away, launching certain targeted sanctions, those things, when we launched them during the days of the struggle, it was because of our moral clarity and moral conviction. The African National Congress of today doesn't have moral conviction, doesn't have moral clarity, does not have the depth of analysis economically, historically, and politically. But what I will give them credit for, they are making the right noises. At least they are making the right noises. Whether they've got the backbone now to go ahead and implement countermeasures against settler colonialism, imperialism, and genocide is another matter altogether. And I believe South Africans must stand against imperialism, colonialism, and genocide. It's in our best interest to do that.
After the break, we will continue the conversation. We know what happened last year. Lady R arrives in Simonstown, and of course, it does irritate the United States government to an extent that its ambassador in this country makes damning allegations. After the break, we talk whether relations between South Africa and the United States is sweet or sour. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're, of course, looking ahead to the AGOA summit that is starting this week in Nasrec, Johannesburg. Professor Bond, last year, Lady R arrives at Simonstown. We saw the report, of course, by retired Judge Phineas Mojapelo, saying nothing untoward had occurred. That is, of course, contradicting to what the US ambassador in this country, Ruben Brigadier, said, that arms were loaded on the ship. You could sense right there, could you, that the relations between the two countries was just going to an all-time low, wasn't it?
Yes, but that was also after, it was in May that Ruben Brigadier made this foolish remark and said, I'll bet my life on it. I hope he's been kept on suicide watch because, he's lost that bet, I think. The question, though, is whether we're going to see that report. And it wasn't only that, there was the naval exercises that occurred between Durban and Richards Bay in the February-March period, in which there was the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. There were many other, little irritants to U.S. imperialism. There was a lot of what Sandile celebrated, talk left, in the ANC's policy documents that Ruben Brigadier particularly mentioned. He said, this is an insulting document. And, everybody knows the ANC's documents have really nothing to do with what the government's all about. It's always a left-wing liberatory rhetoric that you find. Now, what I think is really going on, though, is that the U.S. has these two factions, the Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats wanted to show the Republicans that they could be tough and that they were trying to maneuver geopolitics so that there wasn't this multipolar alternative to the US emerging, and they wanted to basically scare South Africa. What I think happened is that they realized in August at the Sandton meeting of the BRICS, the main thing they were worried about was de-dollarization. Maybe Sandile will disagree, but I think that was what they were panicking. And they found that at the Sandton Convention Center, where the big boys from the BRICS, with the exception of Putin, who couldn't make it because of the ICC arrest warrant, they didn't do anything. And it was such a disappointment for those of us. And I happened to work for 2 years in the US Federal Reserve, and that's the main point where back in 1944, the gold-dollar relationship that was set by Jan Smuts and the US financial establishment, that gets played out because the US Federal Reserve has used that gold relationship until 1973 to control the world economy. And then it was rooted. So we're all dependent on the dollar. And I think, like all of you, I would like to see that ended. And we were so heartbroken, weren't we, that at the Sandton Convention Center, nothing happened. The most conservative forces in our BRICS countries, like our Reserve Bank Governor, Lesego Kganyago, our Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, the BRICS Business Council, led by Sim Chabalala from Standard Bank, they all basically said there will be no de-dollarization. We're not part of that. They were saying we're financial sub-imperialists. And I think that, in a way, has made that Democratic Party, corporate liberal elite wing of the United States political scene, much more relaxed, much more able to put AGOA here. It was at one point a question whether we were even going to have this meeting here in South Africa. And also, it maybe puts the Republicans on the back foot. And they're going to have to, I think, really work hard with their subtle racism, and sometimes it's overt, to say we don't want South Africa in the AGOA. And that we probably will see happen in a big way in 2025. So I think all of the fuss and all of the action, all of the excitement, all of the worries that we're going to see the next couple of days may be a moot point, and that's regardless of whether Trump is elected, because those House of Representative Republicans, they can create chaos, and I wouldn't bet that the AGOA would be extended to South Africa in 2025 as it goes now because of the terrible political balance of forces in the US.
Mr. Swana, sweet or sour?
I think that our relationship with the United States is going to be difficult because also, we're not the principal movers in this relationship. The United States is relating to us by saying they want to set the stage and want to use us as their principal pawn on the African continent and perhaps as an entry point into the global south, one way or the other. And some of our people, our leaders, are aware of this and will go on for the ride. So it may not necessarily be as easy for South Africa to be kicked out of AGOA, but there's going to be a lot of pressure. And I didn't want to say this, but I said something like this when people were complaining about African leaders and attending the summit in Russia. I said, since the days of Kwame Nkrumah, we've had a problem with these African leaders when it comes to pro-Africa decisions, because they are not averse, even in the Israeli question, the government of Israel. We cannot rule out that some of these people run around talking nonsense and misrepresenting Africa because they are being paid to do that. And the ANC is not above that. Its leaders, some of its leaders, getting certain quiet rewards and this and the other thing. So that is why I say at least even a disgraced ANC is still able to make what I call the right noises, at least. That though they have fallen, at least they are still able to make one right noise, even though they may be agreeing substantively to other things that we don't. So the relationship between the ANC and the USA, let's put it like that, because I think that's where our politics are at. I would say it's a sweet and sour thing, And the US and Israel and others, people, Macron and others, will keep sweetening even the individual leaders themselves.
Professor Bond, last year, President Cyril Ramaphosa, as he's been doing since he's becoming the president of the Republic, has gone on the charm offensive wherever he's gone. Last year, of course, to meet the British Prime Minister. At that time, of course, Rishi Sunak had just entered the frame. He then, of course, went to go and visit the new King of England. And then you had him, of course, visiting the White House with President Joe Biden. Those charm offensives, Professor Bond, there's, of course, the question marks whether it will work or not. But is he, and I know it's difficult to put yourself in his position, but is he really confident, listening to him, that these relationships will be maintained for eternity?
Yes, I mean, as someone who's been in Gaza, I've spent a week a dozen years ago in the east side, the north side, Gaza City, where we've seen so much bombing. I met some Hamas leaders, and I've seen, in a way, what the respect that the Palestinian people have for South Africa's struggle and their desperate need for South Africa to not only have, for example, in the United Nations, some strong rhetoric and a desire for a ceasefire, which may help.
Okay, we seem to have lost Professor Bond there. I'm going to come to you, Mr. Swana, just to maybe another question to tail on that. I want to go to, of course, Lady R and Dirko, obviously the International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, in her ability to go ahead and speak to Ruben Brigadier, but in a subtle way, put him in his place. Do you feel at that time you could sense that South Africa has some sort of strength, even if it's very little, but there's something to tell the United States, listen, we will not be succumbing to your demands every single time you want it?
Yes, I think Naledi Pandor, as an individual politician, individual activist, anti-apartheid activist, to a degree, he has maintained the DNA of Oliver Tambo in this particular season. I've been the first one to admit that these fellows have drifted off the main point that Tambo had put us on earlier at an earlier date. So for him to be able to tell the United States that you cannot dictate terms to us, especially in these international struggles, that is very important, and she's competent at that. Obviously, the moral strength and the moral background to take decisive political action on the ground is another issue.
Okay, we seem to have lost Professor Bond. We hope we'll be able to get him after the break, of course, to wrap up the conversation. We will be, of course, talking about, is there an obligation by South Africa to be part of AGOA? To stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. Professor Bond, we're glad to have you back. Just to continue, obviously, from that question I asked on President Ramaphosa's charm offensive.
I think President Ramaphosa works the charm sometimes, but when it's really crucial, he fails. And that has included his trip to both President Zelensky and President Putin in June. Remember, he went to Ukraine and then to Moscow. I think the most important was a year earlier in 2022. And that was when he asked, alongside Narendra Modi, for the vaccines for COVID-19 to be taken off the intellectual property, right? They needed a waiver so we could end vaccine apartheid. He failed. Now, what scope is there for him succeeding, perhaps in some way, as a mediator? He's obviously very strongly allied with the Palestinian cause, and Israelis wouldn't have much to do with him. On the other hand, I remember when my own hometown, Belfast, Northern Ireland, was completely broken down, and President Ramaphosa did some quite miraculous things to put the Irish Republican Army and the Ulster reactionary Protestants back into an alignment. It actually did a peace deal. Now, the dilemma is that at the moment, the real power to settle this, one way or the other, militarily, if it's a terrible conflagration at the regional level, especially if Iran, Syria, Lebanon get pulled into this. But also when it comes to the kind of pressures that the Arab countries could put on Israel in a non-violent way. And I think that ultimately is the way we also helped to end the apartheid regime here, wasn't it? It was the combination of mass protests, some guerrilla activity, but let's be frank, the sanctions that were used, financial sanctions in September 1985, did break the alliance of white capital and the white state. And I would say it's time again, as Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement in Palestine, says, it's time to get back to the boycott, divestment sanctions. I hope we'll all go out. And at this point, even a BDS against AGOA makes all sorts of sense. And as someone who showed a film about sanctions when I was in Gaza about a dozen years ago, invited by Ayat Siraj, the great psychiatrist, there was a standing ovation. It wasn't because of me, it was because the film I showed, which is called Have You Heard from Johannesburg? The bottom line about the success of sanctions to defeat apartheid in 1985. Again, along with guerrilla activity, but especially social protests from below. Those are the sorts of formula that I hope we can all get back to. And instead of Abraham Accords, where the UAE and possibly Saudi Arabia empower Benjamin Netanyahu, we need to really continue to delegitimize this Zionist apartheid regime in Tel Aviv.
Mr. Swana, South Africa, it's clear they want to be part of AGOA because obviously when it comes to trade, it does sit in the trillions of rands and it is quite strong in terms of South Africa's trading partner. But what we've seen of the United States is that they like to act as the patriarch of the world. And I'm using the word patriarch because they want to be seen as the strong figure when it comes to global economics and global politics. When South Africa looks at it, given all the economic challenges that we have had, does South Africa have to be part of AGOA to make sure that economically the country is heading into the right direction?
Thank you. Let's start off with the political reasoning behind this. Let's start off there before we come to the economics of it. The United States has put it in writing in the AGOA Act and all these places that if you are going to be part of AGOA, you are going to be required to comply with U.S. international interests, foreign policy interests, and security interests. Those security interests is another open-ended thing because it could mean, for instance, you could align yourself with them in their NATO, USA-NATO fight with Putin and all sorts of things. It could implicate you in all sorts of things. But that is what AGOA is about. It's about politics of the United States. Economically, Professor Patrick Bond has tried to give you a measurement. There are two types of measurements around the economy of AGOA. Before AGOA was launched 23 years ago in 2000, the Americans were doing business with South Africa. Today, there are still those people, the business that we're doing, just ordinary normal business with the Americans in general, is far more, several multiples more than this AGOA thing. So, and secondly, as has been pointed out by Professor Patrick Bond, the people who are actually benefiting in the past 23 years out of AGOA is big international business and to whatever extent, some big South African business. This is not empowering the guy in El Dorado Park, empowering the guy in Umtata or in Mtuba or in Thohoyandou. It's not about empowering. So if we look at what have the Americans actually done to reduce unemployment and poverty in South Africa in 23 years, it's absolutely nothing. So AGOA, when you agree to be part of AGOA, if I may be brutally honest, you are just subjugating yourself to American foreign policy and American security interest. I would therefore advocate that we look at developing programs in Africa, programs in Asia, programs in Latin America for indigenous local companies to start doing genuine business that is not tainted by Western imperialism going forward. We don't need to be part of AGOA, not at all.
Professor Bond, South Africa has taken quite a large chunk from the World Bank for its renewable project. And obviously the United States being one of those countries that are involved in it. And that's just part of some of the economic, the micro and macroeconomic decisions that have been made by South Africa. But should South Africa be looking at it like Mr. Swana says, independence, focus in it from an African point of view? Or is South Africa just too reliant on the United States and the West for it to have that foreign investment?
I entirely agree with Sandile on this point because my guru on this was the greatest African political economist, Samir Amin, an Egyptian who lived his career in Dakar. And his term for what we should be pursuing, delinking, identifies areas where being in league with Western capital sets us back. And the most obvious was with the big pharma corps that were providing AIDS medicines. You remember they charged over 100,000 rand a year. And so what at that time the Treatment Action Campaign said was, let's de-link from those US pharma corps and produce with generics locally and support a government that was, even with a president who was an AIDS denialist, able to send out for 5 million people at the time, AIDS medicines that then raised life expectancy from 52 to 65, certainly our greatest accomplishment post-apartheid. And I think that's the delinking. We've seen so many other interesting examples. I mean, I'm somebody who drives around the Gauteng highways. Maybe some of your viewers do as well. And we don't pay our e-tolls because they were put on inappropriately without consultation. And they were done for the benefit mainly of an Austrian company, Capsch. Well, we've basically killed that e-tolling. We've also done the same to a World Bank subsidiary based in London, the headquarters, Net1, the local subsidiary, Cash Paymaster Services. And we had a group called Black Sash that went out there and basically put that company to death. We did the same thing with Bell Pottinger because it was the Gupta's PR firm spreading fibs and ruining, with their bots from India, ruining the political environment. I think in so many ways, South Africans can show the world that delinking, as Samir Amin advised, is the appropriate way. And that would give us the opportunity to rebuild manufacturing like clothing and textiles and footwear and appliances and electronics. Now, you could rebut that, well, most of those are coming to us from Asia, from especially the east coast of China, those huge factories. And I'd say, yes, same argument. Delinking is what we need to do to have much more balance in the economy, much less reliance upon digging the non-renewable resources out of the ground, impoverishing our children and grandchildren, creating terrible climate change processes with the big smelters emitting so much and the big Eskom coal-fired power plants. And it's in that formula of relinking with society, with the environment, with the African continent, by delinking with the West and, frankly, the other BRICS countries, that I hope more sane minds, political economists, political ecologists, feminists, anti-racists, anti-imperialists will begin to cohere.
Gentlemen, we've just got under 2 minutes, so I'm going to give you each around 45 seconds for your closing statements. I'm going to start off with you, Mr. Swana, and then Professor Pond.
On the question of AGOA, my view is that Africans should start thinking, and the people of the Global South, about creating independence, including the issue of the dollarization of the economies, that we must not be dominated by the dollar. We must not be dominated politically by the Americans and NATO group. Just think what business we can do with Indonesia. Just Indonesia. Just think of all these great nations that we look at and we don't even attend to the opportunities they are presenting to us. So that would be my closing remark.
Professor Bond?
Well, I think since this has been a discussion that not only looked at trade and the United States imperial power, but scanned some of the other matters that are of greatest concern to our society. But it does come back, doesn't it, to justice for Palestinians. And it's there that I am so impressed with BDS because they are linking the issues. I mean, we have climate activists beginning to say, what are the implications of war, of the Pentagon, or our own military-industrial complex in South Africa, especially with a man like Ivor Ichikowitz. I think this is the time for those of good faith who'd like to see Palestinian liberation, but also would like to see the climate saved for our future generations, would like to see a more balanced economy, to come out and protest against AGOA at Nasrec between 2 and 6 p.m. on Saturday, November 4. And I hope to see you there.
Definitely. Professor Patrick Bond, Mr. Sandile Swana, gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time for us today on Talking Point on Hilaal TV. Gentlemen,
okay, great. You'll forgive me if I say bye-bye very fast to get to my next meeting.
Yeah.
See you
No
again.
problem.
Sandile, we'll get together, I hope. Bye.
Okay, cheers, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Bye.
That is Professor Patrick Bond, Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. And of course, political analyst Sandile Swana. He's a lot of the times right here on our screens. You see him a lot, of course, on Hilaal Live, giving commentary on many of the political ongoings here in South Africa. The AGOA Summit, of course, starting tomorrow here in South Africa. That's all we have for you here on Talking Point. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.